Hello and welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. This is your host Greg Payne coming at you from Studio 12. This podcast is about being the best possible grandpa you can be, focusing on what it is to be a grandpa and how we can all share that experience together for our grandchildren. Hi, and welcome back to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. I'd like to introduce today's guest, Victoria Miniger. And Victoria is a wife, a mom, and owner and CEO of Bear Creek Outdoor Living. That's a residential construction firm. Now, Victoria, upon all of those things, is also a writer, an author, a speaker, and a down-in-the-dirt gardener. Now, Victoria has written a book called Daring to Fight: When Grit, Grace, and Faith Take Depression Head On. Today, our conversation, though, is going to be focused on her grandfathers and the lasting legacy that they've had on her life. We're going to get to be introduced to Grandpa Ben Gomez and Granddaddy Orin Kaiser, two grandfathers from completely different parts of the country. One is from New Mexico, and the other is from the Blue Ridge, Shenandoah areas of Virginia. So although it's two different worlds, you guys are going to learn how they both loved and cherished Victoria and what that love and support has meant to her over the years. So I know you're going to enjoy this conversation. Tighten up your shoelaces if you're going for a walk, or better yet, grab yourself a beverage, pull up a chair, and join us for an awesome conversation. Thank you, Victoria, for joining us on the Cool Grandpa Podcast. I really appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to talk with me about your grandfathers and let us know a little bit about how that relationship was.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me, Greg. It's just been awesome. And it's been fun as I've been preparing to just talk with you and stuff to think about my grandfathers. And so I have two grandfathers. Actually, one I was grandpa and the other was my granddaddy. He was called Granddaddy, and then my grandfather or grandpa out in New Mexico was my dad's father, was grandpa. So my dad's father, my grandpa in New Mexico, his name was Ben Gomez. Yeah, so I actually grew up in my early years around my grandpa Gomez because I was born in New Mexico. They lived right behind us, and so till the age of 10, I was around him a lot. And then my other grandfather, or grandpa, he was in Virginia, and that's where my mother is from. And I didn't get to know him as well until I was a teenager, because then we moved to Virginia. At that point in time, I did see him like once a year. And as far as my memory is recalling, I remember visiting him and getting to know him a little bit. But I can tell you they're two vastly different worlds, because my father is Spanish American Indian, and then my grandfather, my mom's side, is conservative Mennonite. So okay. Two vastly different worlds.
Yeah, well, and not just culturally, but geographically and everything that comes with it. I've had the opportunity to be on a business trip out to New Mexico and just saw all the changes and differences, and that's where I learned about green sauce and red sauce.
Oh yes, it's very different out there.
Was in New Mexico, so very different from being in the Blue Ridge Mountain, Shenandoah areas of Virginia. So
yes, absolutely. And it was, I remember visiting Virginia when I was a little girl and stuff, and it was vastly different. The weather was different. Yeah, like you said, culture was different. And not in a bad way, but it was just different. Yeah. So right. Best of both worlds.
Oh, absolutely. Well, the thing that is awesome about that too is that you get exposed to those different cultures and those different work ethics and those different, viewpoints on life along with that. It's just a richness that sometimes you don't always pause and think about, especially if you grew up in the same small town in Ohio and, your grandfather was just the one town over and the other grandfather was the next town over. Not that those aren't rich relationships, but it's just different when you have your families are from vastly different areas of the country.
Yeah, no, it definitely is different and stuff. And it has its positive, it has its things that I think about, there's times I wish that I was close to both of them as far as living was concerned, because, I'm sure that I missed out on things that I didn't get to know about my grandfathers from both times that I probably missed a lot, but they also, I think, as I think back, were very intentional about connecting with me when I was living close to them and that sort of thing. And I can tell you that the one thing that transcended culture, transcended just the differences of our lives, was their faith. Both of them were men of faith, and that was very much the same. And how they expressed that was different, but yeah, it was kind of a cool connection.
Yeah. Now, what were some of the earliest memories that you had of your grandfather? I can imagine most of those early memories would have been around your grandpa, right? Grandpa Ben.
They would have been. Yeah, my grandpa Ben Gomez. So we grew up on just about 3 acres, and my grandparents were right behind us, and they were on a couple acres, and they had a little bit of a farm. And my grandpa was very much the guy that was outdoors and always chopping wood. He was in the field, and he was always one that invited us along. Like, it was never one of those things where we as kids couldn't come and join him in. And so it was not uncommon for us to finish breakfast, and as long as our chores were done, we could head over to Grandma and Grandpa's, and we would dash across the field and see what he was up to, because he was always up to something interesting. At least we thought it was interesting, and he'd always include us, and so that was pretty cool. And so yeah, I spent a lot of time as a child just over at their place and just traipsing along after him. He never didn't allow us to come. He just included us in what he did, which was really awesome.
Oh, that's fantastic, because you also get to see a little bit of that farming ingenuity, I would imagine. There was probably some times you ran over and there was baling wire and there's scrap pieces of this and that and the other thing that were all being used to fasten something together, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And he'd always explain, in his way of what he was doing and coming up with. And he would let us do stuff I'm sure nowadays, like, kids wouldn't be allowed to do. I still remember riding on the back of the tractor. He had created this, it wasn't a plow really. It was a way to scrape the rocks out of the field. And it was this box, and it had this grate on it. He would allow us to sit on the back of that grate. It would be above the ground, so we weren't in danger, but he'd let us ride that and help throw out the rocks and stuff. I mean, that was a cool grandpa, because he let us do stuff like that.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, were there moments even at that point where there was maybe some time for just you and your grandpa Ben to connect and do some activities that was a little bit like, okay, this is what we do, sort of a thing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know that with my grandpa Ben so much, because I have 2 older brothers, and we were also a farming family. And so my dad had a dairy farm. We had a dairy farm. And so when you have dairy farms and you just have farms together, you do everything together. And so I can't really recall memories of where it was just me and him. But, again, we were always included. And sometimes I was over there by myself, but we never had anything like, oh, let's go to town and do this special thing together. The special thing was just day-to-day work together. And he made it fun. And he was just a hilarious character. He's very optimistic. Like, he was always speaking well of people and just had the greatest outlook on life, even if things were just going really bad, or the pigs got out or the chickens got out or whatever. Yeah, I just don't remember him being cross. And now that didn't mean that he didn't hold the line if we weren't listening or paying attention. You most certainly knew that you had to mind Grandpa, else you'd get in trouble. But, it was never anything that we were afraid of him for. So.
Oh, sure. Well, it's a common theme that through these interviews that people have, where as little kids, you would definitely test the boundaries with your parents, right? And push those things. But for some reason with grandpas and probably grandmas too, there was a little bit of, you knew what the boundaries were. You might press them a little bit, but not a whole lot, because there was part of you that a lot of times we have it, right? That we want to impress this person. We want to show them that, hey, we can pick up those rocks and we can move them off the field and we can do these things, where, that relationship tends to be that's the mentor that we want to impress. That, boy, we don't want to get on their bad side. And it's just, it's an interesting dynamic when that, between grandfathers and grandchildren in that respect.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and he always made it fun too. So even if we had a task that we had to complete, he always had some way of, let's race, let's do this. I still remember we were sitting at breakfast one morning, I don't know, while we were staying over or something like that. And he was always who could clean their plate the most, right? And so he always had a tortilla to finish out the plate and all the eggs and stuff. And he would make it as clean as he could. And man, if you could make it, your plate as clean as Grandpa's, like you won. I can't remember what you win. He would give us something little or whatever. But yeah, it was like, even though, yeah, we wanted to really hold to his expectation of being able to do those things.
Oh, wow. It's amazing, that difference between how you react to a grandfather and how you react maybe to your dad. But it's also something too that for other grandpas to keep in mind is that, during this time, it is about, playing, and it is about making sport out of whatever it is you're doing, whether it's chores or whatnot. I can remember my grandfather had a wheat farm, and we had these irrigation pipes. And so he had this ditch and these siphon hoses, basically, that you would, have to do a couple of runs in the water and then lay it down and to irrigate the field. And it was always a thing about, how many strokes does it take to get that siphon going? And can you do it as good as Grandpa, right? So my brothers and I are running around and we're trying to get these siphon hoses going. And then once we would be able to do one, then Grandfather would take 2 hoses in the palm of his hand and do it. And then it would be like, okay, now try to do this. And so it was always making a game of it. And for a couple of, city kids, it was a fun time trying to get a helpful chore done in the fields.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. They're fun that way.
Yep. There's a little bit of that Tom Sawyer, I think it was, about how fun it is to whitewash the fence. Within the grandfathers. No, come over here, pick up these rocks. This is blast. You're going to have fun.
Yeah, exactly.
So how did the relationship start to change and evolve a little bit as you started going from elementary school to middle school, or, at least in those years around those grades?
So we ended up moving when I was 10. So I think I was going into, maybe it was, 4th grade, something like that, 5th grade or whatever. And so we landed up moving across the country to Virginia. At the time, we actually landed up losing our farm because the whole Pasteurization Act came through. And when that happened, we just couldn't upgrade all the equipment to do those things. Anyway, so we landed up selling our farm, or I guess technically we lost the farm. But anyway, lost the farm in that whole thing. And my parents decided to move back to Virginia, where my mother is from, and stuff. So at that point, what changed was I just wasn't around him all the time. And so I remember writing letters and some things like that, which lasted for a while. But over time, even that kind of, he wasn't a big writer, but we would go back and see them once a year. And we'd go back and see them, and it was like nothing had ever changed. We'd always go look at all the spots that we had, where we had grown up and all the fun things we had done. And he'd take us around and show us all the things that had been happening that year and stuff. But definitely our relationship changed just because we weren't there. And it's not like today where you have social media and you have email and you have all these things. It was it was vastly different. I remember talking to him on the phone because my dad would call regularly down to check on his parents and see how they're doing. And of course they're yakking away in Spanish and all this stuff. And but then we would hop on the line and talk to Grandma and Grandpa for a little while. And so it definitely changed. And I think that's probably where I, regret that maybe I wasn't able to stay in touch as much as I would have liked to. As a kid, you don't think about those things, I guess.
Right.
And all. But I think the other part too is, as I got older, my dad would even share with me stories about my grandfather. My grandpa Gomez was in World War II, and, really, again, just really changed him. And just some things that he just shared about my grandpa's life of resiliency and how he comes through some tough things that changed my view of my grandpa in a good way of, when I was a kid, you would never have known he'd gone through really hard times because he was so optimistic. His faith seemed so strong. And so, I think about that man. I think about that grandpa that went through some really hard things in his life. And there's a part of me that wishes I knew him better from those things and would have heard his stories about those things.
Sure. It's interesting too, because I'm talking with new grandfathers now that do have the social media and they're doing the FaceTime with the grandkids and things. But, I grew up around the same time where my grandfather lived across the country. I'd see him every so often. We'd typically multiple weeks at a time. But yeah, there was a period of time where there wasn't much letter writing. There was a few phone calls here and there. But then, and I think this is you have to be older to appreciate it. So once I hit my 20s and 30s, as I started to go on more business trips, that was when I could do postcards to him. Right.
Oh, nice.
And I could do some of those things. But, when you're 16, 17 years old, life is what's happening tomorrow. It's not necessarily thinking about those relationships, even though they mean a lot to us. So it's an interesting thing where, as we grow up, we get different perspectives. We find out things that, we want to dive into somebody's history and find out what was going on at the time. And, it's weird. We do want those time machines to be able to jump back and sit down now that we realize things about our grandfathers. But
yeah, those are things I value now. And, he's not here for me to go backwards and to do that, and stuff. But like you said, when we're teenagers and stuff, we don't think about those things. And so I think for the grandfathers listening, be intentional with your grandkids, as you go along, knowing that, it's not that they don't maybe want to hang out with you or whatever, but they're, remember when you're a teenager, your world is here. Right. And so to be into, I watch how my in-laws and how my parents are with my children. And of course we're close, we live close, but they're intentional. And I want to be that kind of grandparent when it's my turn to be a grandparent as well. So.
Well, and that's a great point in that I did have somebody else bring up with me that their perspective was it's really the grandparents' role for their early years, at least, to be intentional about that relationship. Because to our points, right? When you're 10 years old, it's all about whatever the greatest toy is that's coming out. It's all about what's happening today. And then even as teenagers. So I think it is important for grandparents you got to put forth the effort, and it's not that the kids don't want to, they're not mindful enough to do it.
Right. Right. Yeah. And it's not always the big grand gestures. Like it doesn't have to be a big grand thing, coffee, take them out for coffee and just listen to their life. That's, I think the biggest thing I see in my children's lives with their grandparents is that, they're intentional to take them out for the little things and just, like I said, coffee and show interest in their lives. And they just do it consistently over and over again, because, if you only do it every once in a while, you don't end up building that relationship that then they begin to appreciate when they're older and in college, like my kids are now. I mean, they really love and appreciate their grandparents now more than they knew to do when they were 10.
Oh, absolutely. Now, how did you get the relationship going or how did it develop as you moved to Virginia now you've got a new grandfather, let's say. You had contact with him before this move, right? But this is, now it's somebody you're seeing a lot more often. So you're starting to get to know them a little bit better.
Right. Yeah. And my grandfather Kaiser, which my mom's dad, Orin Kaiser was his name. And he was a quiet man from what I remember. He was also a farmer. I mean, my mom shows me pictures of them raising turkeys and stuff. And like I said, my mom was raised conservative Mennonite. And so farming and stuff, but my grandfather was a clockmaker and as well. And so I have early memories of before we lived here sitting in his clock shop at his house. And I remember the smell of his clock shop and he would give me these long trails. Like he would be shaving a piece of wood or whatever, and it caused these long tails to come off, and he would let me play with those. And I remember the smell. It was interesting because, I own and run a construction company now, and sometimes I'll step into our shop, and there's a certain kind of wood, and I still haven't necessarily pinpointed what kind, but there's different types of woods that will trigger those memories for me of sitting with my grandfather in his clock shop as he just quietly worked away. He would build grandfather. I don't know if you would know, most people would know what a grandfather clock is or a grandmother clock, these super tall clocks. He would make these for a living. And then he repaired clocks as well. And so we did have those early years of just connecting when we would visit. And then when we moved here, we actually ended up moving fairly close a few years after we got here. We moved like a couple houses down from him and stuff. And there was a season of time where my parents were both working and I was not quite, my parents didn't want me staying by myself. And so I would go to my aunt and uncle's house, which was also close to my grandfather, during the summertime. And at like twice a week, we would all go out to lunch and my grandfather always came. And so those were those moments where I got to know my grandfather, because that was one, he has a lot of grandchildren.
Okay.
Because there was like, I don't know, there were, my mom's one of 7. And so lots of grandchildren, right? And so I never had time just with my granddad. And so the fact that I could have lunch with him all summer long with just him and my aunt and uncle, I mean, he was a quiet man, but that's probably when I really started to get to know him better, and want to be around him and just hang out with him. So.
Right. It's as you get in those middle school and then high school years, it's that relationship changes to being more of an adult to an adult relationship. I mean, you're still young, you still, everybody's got their teenage stuff going on, but there's more to where you can start to share ideas a little bit and start to talk about what's going on and your perspective. And, it's not just about, boy, I can't wait till this is done so we can go get an ice cream.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and too, again, most of the time when I hung around my granddaddy, I was with my parents or whatever. I didn't actually just go to his house. My grandmother had passed away when I was 6 years old, and so he had never remarried, and so he lived on his own and stuff. But he didn't live very far from us, and so we most certainly would go down and help him pick walnuts up out of his yard, because he had these awful walnut trees that were like, I don't know, it felt like he had 1 million walnut trees. And our job was to pick up all the walnuts. And so we would help him do that. But probably because he was a fairly quiet man, there's probably times I just didn't really get to know him, because he didn't talk a lot, but that was okay. There was that, those times where you can sit with somebody, you don't have to really say a whole lot, but there's just this, this real easy kind of just being together. It was very similar. It was very much like that. It wasn't awkward by any means.
Okay. Yeah, it's amazing. I think sometimes that idea of just sharing the energy of being around it's that unspoken, and it drives certain people absolutely crazy. Where you could take a car drive and not say anything for 45 minutes and just really enjoy being around somebody, and then there's other personality types or whatever that would, 3 minutes into the silence and they're going absolutely nuts.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I tend to be a bit more of an introvert, so maybe our personalities just really jive together. I don't know, but I actually recall riding in his car with him, like when, he would need to go to town and he would need somebody to come with him to help him with something. I often went with him, and I still remember what his car looked like. It was one of those ones with that long bench seat in the front, right? Okay. And so, and it was just this older car and stuff, but I loved riding along with him because he always would get me a treat of some sort. I never asked for it, but he just always, bought candy or whatever. And I still actually remember, this is when we still lived in New Mexico. He came down to visit our family, and he actually had relatives in Colorado, not far, a couple hours from where we lived in New Mexico. And I still remember my mom let me go with him, and it was just me and my granddaddy, and we went and visited his family. And I recall we had a very long road trip, but I don't know, it was fun, and we didn't say a whole lot. We just traveled together.
Oh, very cool.
But that was okay. So, yeah.
Wow. Now, how did the relationship mature as you started to get into high school and further into high school, right? So you're not a little girl anymore. You're even older, and you're starting to look at colleges or what's life beyond high school. And how did that relationship change and mature along with you?
Yeah, so I think probably the biggest change that I can think of is that I just, you go from just being a kid where grandpa helps you with everything, or you're just kind of hanging out with grandpa, to where for me, my grandparents were old enough that they were really starting to age and needed help. Okay. And so it became one of those things where we're going down to help granddaddy because he needs help with X, Y, and Z, different things and stuff. So it almost became not a caretaker role, but you shift a little bit. So all of a sudden you realize, hey, hey, they need me here and I want to be available to help and just really care for them. And, that's kind of my personality anyway, as far as that's concerned. And so I felt like it became more adult-like. Now, I married very young. I was 19 when I got married. I remember my grandfather was at my wedding, and I still have a great picture of him and stuff. And he ended up passing away probably, let's see, Brian and I got married in July. He passed away in September of that year. And so I'm thankful that he was at our wedding and he was able to participate in that. But he ended up passing away. I guess he was probably late 70s, early 80s when he passed away. So still relatively, to me, young.
Sure.
So, we missed out on some of that time, I think, as I became more of an adult. But the memories I have of him are still really good. Now my grandpa Ben, he continued to live, I think, probably 5 or 6 years into as I was married. I've been married 24 years now, but so he got to know my husband, and he actually got to meet 3 of his great grandchildren before he passed away. So that was kind of cool.
Very good. What were some of the things, thinking back on those relationships now, what are some of the things that, whether they were intentional or unintentional, that you think about the lessons that you may have learned from either observing what they did or by pitching in and working alongside of your grandfathers?
Yeah, so I think, it's different for both of them. I think for my grandpa Ben, he was just a very resilient man, but he never took himself too seriously, in life. He always treated people well. As I sit and think of it as an adult, often people would come to his farm and he was always lending a hand. Having known that he went through a war, knowing that he went through some really hard things. He used to actually be an alcoholic prior to when my dad was a teenager. And then literally he came to faith and literally went home and broke all the alcohol bottles in his house and never touched a drop. And so he made a radical shift. Even though I never heard that story from him, I heard that story from my father later on. And just knowing the kind of man he was, and that resiliency, to me, that's a lesson right there, is that, we can make choices in our life to be better. And I think his choice to do that caused a strong legacy to follow then in his children and his grandchildren, and like I said, for me, just my grandfather's faith was never showy. It was just there, and to me, that's powerful. So much part of who he was. And it was so meaningful to him that it was very evident, but not being pushy or like showy or anything.
Right. It was a solid foundation of faith.
Yeah.
That because he was living his faith. It wasn't hey, look at me, and hey, here's all this attention to it. It's just, you noticed it day in and day out when you were around them.
Yeah. Yeah. And you knew that's where he derived his strength from. So, he never shied away from saying that or anything. He was, both of my grandfathers were very private men, I think, but that didn't keep them from living life with their children and their grandchildren, which I think is important.
Having viewed your relationship with your grandfathers, what advice would you have for old guys like me and other grandfathers out there about developing a strong relationship with your grandchildren?
I think the biggest thing is just stay consistent in their lives. It's easy to get caught up in all the things that we're doing, in the busyness, because life doesn't stop being busy just because, you become a grandpa or grandma and then, you move to these different years, we have 2 daughters getting ready to get married. So I'm already beginning to think, a couple years down the road, we're going to be grandparents. I'm hopeful stuff, but I don't want my life to ever become so busy that I don't have time to invest in those relationships. And so, and investing again is in the little, would be in the little things, in just being consistent, but also being very intentional. I think we have to be intentional in relationships in our lives if we really want them to grow. And and that's the same with our grandkids just as much.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm finding out too, is that's also good advice in general about relationships. Whether it is a grandfather to grandchild or friend to friend, right? It's sometimes you can't sit back and wait for somebody to give you a call to go grab coffee. It's, okay, you make the phone call to go grab coffee.
Right. Yeah. And often I think that's like, at least just viewing it from my perspective, watching my daughters and their one grandmother in particular, she's incredibly intentional about calling them. She doesn't wait for them. And she never apologizes for calling them. And they always know they can say no if it doesn't suit or whatever. She makes sure that they know that that's okay, that she's not going to be offended or it's not going to hurt her feelings or whatever. But then when she is with them, I think she just listens. And I think that's the other part is, we're never going to probably really understand the world that our kids and our grandkids live in because it's always changing. It's different than when we grew up. But I don't know that we always have to understand it, but we can be present for it.
Well, and that's such a huge part of it is just being present and being aware and being plugged in and connected to whatever that conversation is that you're having right at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's what I remember about my grandparents is that they weren't at everything, and of course it was different back then. Like we talked about earlier, there was no Facebook and all that stuff. So there was much of my life they probably didn't know about, but when we were together, they were present and they weren't distracted by other things. They would include me in what they were doing. And, whether it was being in the clock shop or whether it was tracing after my grandpa, on the farm, they took me along in their everyday life. And that I think helped me get to know them too. It wasn't just okay, well, let's have this family reunion and I get to know you a little bit, but you never learn, I think it's something special about learning about your grandparents' lives. Let them in, let them understand who you are and what you enjoy as well.
Right. Well, and that trust in that intentionality goes both ways. When you are old enough to start asking questions, ask grandma, ask grandpa, what was it like when you were 15? What was going on in your life? Because there's going to be a lot of similarities, and you're going to find out that, grandpa was a geeky teenage boy that had trouble talking to girls, and, and grandma had, whatever else was going on. And it's amazing when I think grandchildren, when they're older, can ask those questions and connect a little bit, that it's not just a one-way thing. So,
Right. Yeah. I think we can never downplay the importance of our presence in somebody's life. Again, I'm not a grandparent yet or anything like that, but, I think about my grandfathers and even though I lived very far away from both of them at different times of my life, I always knew that they were part of my life. Like they just knowing that they were present, that they were an important part of my life and that they loved me, that they really enjoyed having me around when I was there. I don't know. It was very grounding, I guess, as a young lady, as I moved up through my, teenage years into adulthood, to know that there were these two strong men in my life that really wanted me in their life.
Right.
Belonging or feeling wanted in that way is, I think, so important for kids these days.
Well, and I find too is that what the women that I've talked to is that from their perspective, that relationship with grandfather meant a lot in terms of there was some safety and security there. That there were these, older men that just loved them no matter what, that were there for them kind of no matter what. And everything else going on in their lives, there was at least that kind of foundation. There was at least that relationship that was solid. Everything else may seem in flux, life changes are going on, whatever. But then that relationship with grandpa and maybe grandma, but I primarily talked to grandpas. Was like, okay, I can count on that. When I talk to grandpa, this is the relationship. This is what we've got going on. This is
right. Yeah. I think that's the thing. I would never underestimate the power of your presence in your grandchild's life. And even if they never say it, just that continual showing up, I think it's so important.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Anything else about grandpas or grandparenting that maybe come to mind that we haven't talked about?
I don't know that there is. I feel like we've kind of really have dived deep here, which is great. I love the conversation just because it makes me think. I haven't thought for a while about my grandparents, only because they've all passed away now.
Sure.
The legacy that they have left behind is inspiring to me, and I think that maybe that's the piece, is what kind of legacy do you want to, leave for your grandkids, for your children, and stuff. And really it's okay to think that through and plan that. And I don't know if my grandfathers specifically thought about that or whatever, but I do feel like they left a strong legacy in me and in my brothers and in their grandchildren in general.
Any last stories that you'd love to share about Grandpa Ben or Granddaddy Orin?
So I just always remember my Grandpa Ben was a master wood stacker. Like, he had the biggest stacks of wood ever. I think he probably could have gone through 5 winters and never run out of wood. And he never seemed to get tired of chopping wood. And so there are days now, of course, we have some land that we manage, about 42 acres, and we do a lot of wood chopping. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I was working with my dad the other day. We were cutting down a tree and stuff, and he was dressed up in he has his overalls, but he always wears over his clothes. And I looked over and I thought for a moment it was my Grandpa Ben. And it's just interesting how those memories played out there and stuff, because he was always working hard. And I think the other fun one, I think of my granddaddy Kaiser. So those meals that we would go out to on that particularly that one summer that I was staying with my aunt and uncle during the day, and we go to lunch at this same place, Lynn's. 2 things come to mind. I would always order the exact same thing, no joke. It was always spaghetti with meatballs, because we didn't always have that at home. And so I love the same thing over and over again. And my uncle was giving me a hard time about it, not in a bad way, but just giving me a hard time. And my grandfather just very quietly said, "It's okay that she likes what she likes. Perfectly fine." And it was like, yes, validation from my granddaddy, in that, man, I can choose whatever I feel like choosing.
Right.
And then the other memory that comes to me from that time at those lunches is this is just his, even though he's quiet, his silly nature at times. He was okay to be silly, in that he would take his straw paper, and how when you take the paper off the straw, you could scrunch it up. So he'd scrunch it up and he'd put it on the table and be like, "Now watch this." And I thought it was magic every single time. And he would wet the end of that little thing and it would look like a little snake or whatever. And I don't know why I remember that, but I just remember, even though he was quiet, there was a fun side to him, and he was okay to have fun. And so, that was just really cool.
Oh, that is awesome. Well, Victoria, thank you so much for being on the Cool Grandpa podcast. I've enjoyed this time visiting about your grandfathers, and it's awesome to learn about the impact that they've had on your life. So I appreciate this time we've had together. Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much. I have enjoyed it very much, and just reliving the memories a bit. What a great conversation with Victoria. One of my biggest takeaways on this is that the relationships can sometimes be extremely strong based on where everybody's living. And then at other times, it may not be quite as strong, but the underlying foundation is always there for reconnecting. So at times when Victoria would go out to Virginia before they moved there and visit with her granddaddy Orin, and then would move back to Virginia, and then sometimes go back and have relationships with Grandpa Ben back on the farm in New Mexico. It was great to understand how those men put in the time and effort to build that relationship. So when she was visiting, it was like picking right back up with old friends and mentors. So as we go through and we're looking at our different relationships, one of the things I'd love to challenge you on is, what are you doing to build that lasting foundation with your friends? What was your biggest takeaway from this conversation? Let me know by sending me an email at greg@cool-grandpa.com. I'd love to hear what your big takeaway from this conversation was. Remember, be cool. Thank you for listening to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and share it with a friend. That's the best way you can help us to expand our community, as well as get the news out about how valuable grandpas are in the lives of those kids. If you'd like to leave me a comment or shoot me a potential topic for this podcast, please go to www.cool-grandpa.us. Look for the comments tab, fill it out, hit submit. It's as easy as that. Until next time, remember to stay cool.